Hi, this is our group project, The Effects of Climate Change on Polar Bears. I'm Crystal Garcia.
I'm Dustin Wynn.
I'm Monsevia Senor.
And I'm Georgina Williams. All right, so as the climate changes due to human activity, certain ecosystems are becoming increasingly impacted by the results of global warming. As the Arctic has faced many of the consequences of recent climate change, such as ocean warming and sea and land ice melt, these changes are greatly affecting the Arctic and the well-being of polar bears and their ability to thrive. So some of the effects of climate change on the Arctic are the early breakup of sea ice, which basically means that as the globe is warming, sea ice is getting thinner and thinner. And during the colder months, when sea ice is normally much more abundant, that's just not the case anymore. So as the months get warmer and warmer, the sea ice is breaking up earlier in the season. Then overall sea ice melt is just the impact that ocean warming and land and air warming have on the total amount of sea ice in the Arctic. Ocean warming has contributed to sea ice melt as well, and has also impacted the migration patterns of prey that polar bears depend on in the spring to feed themselves and their young. And land ice melt has impacted the habitat of polar bears when they go on land for reproducing and just kind of for general living. And it also impacts things like their ability to camouflage in their natural environment. So the effects that ocean warming has on the Arctic are that the greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere also get absorbed into the ocean, and about 50% of gases either get absorbed into the ocean or biomass such as plants and trees. The greenhouse gases absorbed by the ocean cause the ocean to warm and impact things like sea level rise and sea ice melt and the livelihood of marine animals. The Arctic Ocean has warmed about 2 degrees Celsius since 1990, which has greatly impacted sea ice melt and ocean animal migration patterns. About 80% of marine mammals have started changing their migration patterns and locations to adapt to the warming of the oceans, which not just affects individual species, but also impacts entire food webs. Because of these effects on the ocean, polar bears have lost access to their food that they rely on for survival, such as seals. Many of the animals that they depend on, like seals and sometimes whales, have altered their patterns of migration or have relocated due to the lack of sea ice, something that seals heavily rely on. Without access to the food of polar bears and like what they need to survive due to ocean warming, it's likely that polar bears will starve and see a decline in reproduction because of that.
All right, so how the sea ice affects the polar bears? Ring seals depend on the sea ice for access to food, to breed, and to raise their young. And as we know, polar bears usually hunt ring seals for their food. But in recent decades, this critical habitat has been shrinking. So sea ice concentrations have declined by 13% each decade due to the increasing global temperatures. And so as a result, the seasonal ice is forming later in the fall and it starts breaking up earlier in the spring. So when there's no sea ice platform, the polar bears have no choice but to move to land with little to no access to food. And so with the declining sea ice concentrations, there have been affecting the behavior, health, and reproductive success of the polar bears. So through field observations and remote sensing, we have seen that polar bears are spending much more time on the land and have been fasting for longer periods of time. And as a result of this, mother bears have been producing smaller cub litters, which is projected to continue to decline for possibly future generations, up to 3 polar bear generations.
So, lack of land and ice in the Arctic. In recent years, scientists have noticed an increase in temperature causing land ice to melt rapidly. Usually, land ice, such as mountain glaciers and ice sheets, expand during the winter but shrink and thin in the summer as temperatures naturally have been beginning to rise. As time has progressed and the effects of the climate change have worsened, land ice has continuously been melting with no sign of snow accumulation. This means that climate change has caused ice to stop increasing during the colder months.
As the majority of glacial ice sheets have been disappearing and will continue to disappear by the end of the century, polar bears are losing their natural habitats. Polar bears require land ice for their snow dens where they reproduce and raise their young. And they also require land ice for protection against any potential threats, such as people that are hunting them. And they also depend on the snow and ice to camouflage for hunting any animals that they may be seeking out on land instead of in the ocean or on sea ice. Without land ice or sea ice, polar bears will lose their ability to hunt and raise their young, which will lead to inevitable extinction if nothing is done.
So a majority of what happens to the ice in the Arctic depends on what we do now, whether we mitigate or continue letting carbon emissions remain business as usual. Scientists have two climate models and simulations that they predict for the emission scenarios. So there's the mitigation, which is mid-range, so RCP 4.5, and then the high range, which is like the business as usual, RCP 8.5, and then the volume of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere have an impact on how fast the Arctic will thaw. Due to the impact that climate change has had on the Arctic Sea, many scientists have predicted that 2/3 of the polar bear population will go extinct by 2040. It is because of the rapid melting that land ice is facing that causes for polar bears to have a difficult time hunting. A lack of nutrition will lower the reproduction rates of female polar bears. Again, this creates a high risk for extinction of the polar bears, which will in turn have a major impact on the Arctic seafood chain. As of now, the IUCN lists polar bears as vulnerable on the red list, but if climate change progresses as projected under less conservative climate scenarios, this could quickly change to endangered. Many scientists believe that this may bolster the population of other animal life within the Arctic Sea.
There are many different ways to solve the problem that are leading to potential extinction of polar bears. It would have to start with us and the factories that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and ocean. Fossil fuels emissions are leading factors of climate change, which affects polar bears and their natural habitats. Reducing individual transportations by utilizing public transportation, such as carpooling, public buses, and trains, can also help migrate the impacts of climate change that affect polar bears. In addition to measure individuals can take to reduce the effects of climate change. Measures such as carbon taxes can be placed on large corporations in order to disincentivize large outputs of greenhouse gases. In view to no solutions are put in place and climate change progresses as seen in business as usual climate scenarios, polar bears will lose their natural habitats. If this were to happen, organizations such as animal conservations can help to maintain a steady but small population of polar bears in captivity. We are hopeful that the actions are taken to slow the impacts of climate change so polar bears do not lose their habitats. But many steps need to be taken within the next few years in order to ensure the plenty sea and land ice is left for polar bears and the other animals in the Arctic food chain.